Let's begin where the problem almost always begins. Not with open rebellion, but with subtle agreement. Not with loud denial of truth, but with a quiet adjustment to it. The most dangerous spiritual shifts rarely feel dramatic. They feel reasonable. And that is precisely why they are so destructive. When we talk about the song of compromise, we're not speaking metaphorically just to be poetic. We're speaking psychologically. Every human being lives according to a narrative. You are always telling yourself a story about what is acceptable, what is necessary, what is justified. And when that internal narrative shifts, even slightly, your behavior follows. Compromise doesn't begin with a major fall. It begins with a reframing. You stop calling something sin. You start calling it complexity. You start calling it disobedience. You start calling it growth. You stop saying, God said this is wrong, and start saying, well, times are different. When you feel intelligent about doing it, that's what makes you so dangerous. And it feels kind of serious. The whispers that rigidity is present and flexibility is denied. It feels to be sufficient when you repeatedly adjust your convictions to resist discomfort and train the practice to resist discomfort instead of practice to resistance. Psychologically speaking, every time you violate your stated values without consequence, you weaken your own moral authority. You fracture the unity between what you claim to believe and how you live. And when that fracture widens, something unsettling happens. You lose clarity. You begin to rationalize almost anything. Now let's examine why this is so appealing. Human beings are wired for social belonging. We are extraordinarily sensitive to exclusion. If the cultural environment shifts and your beliefs create tension, you feel pressure. Not necessarily persecution, just discomfort. You don't want to be labeled extreme. You don't want to be misunderstood. You don't want to lose opportunities. So you adjust not all at once, but incrementally. You tell yourself, it's not that serious. You say, God understands my situation. You say, God understands my situation. You say, everyone else is doing it. Notice what's happening there. You're transferring authority from revelation to consensus, from conviction to comfort, from truth to trend. And this is precisely the song the enemy loves, because it doesn't require you to renounce your faith. It only requires you to dilute it, loot it. Compromise feels harmless because it's gradual. There is no alarm bell, no dramatic fall. Just a series of small permissions. But those small permissions accumulate. They reshape identity. They rewire desire. They recalibrate what you tolerate. Philosophically, you cannot live long in contradiction. Either your behavior will rise to your belief, or your belief will lower to your behavior. And lowering belief is always easier. It demands less sacrifice. The problem is that every compromise extracts something from you. It costs you clarity. It costs you moral strength. It costs you spiritual authority. And eventually, it costs you peace, because deep down, you know. You know when you've adjusted truth to avoid discomfort. You know when you've justified what you once would have resisted. And that inner knowledge produces quiet anxiety, a subtle instability, because your life is no longer aligned with your conscience. And here's where this becomes spiritually urgent. When a culture drifts rapidly, the pressure to compromise intensifies. What was once unthinkable becomes normal. What was once shameful becomes celebrated. And if you are not deeply anchored, you will be carried along. This is not about being harsh or self-righteous. It's about integrity. Integrity means wholeness. It means your internal world matches your external confession. It means your private decisions align with your public declarations. The enemy does not need you to abandon Christianity. He only needs you to reinterpret it until it demands nothing. That is the song. It says conviction is intolerance. It says obedience is extremism. It says holiness is outdated. When if you sing that long enough, you won't even remember when you started. But here is the deeper psychological truth. Human beings are strengthened by voluntary constraint. When you choose to live within moral boundaries, you develop discipline, clarity, and identity. When you dissolve those boundaries, you don't become freer. You become fragmented. But freedom without structure collapses into chaos. And chaos produces fear, and fear makes you easier to control. So the call here is not to retreat from the world and paranoia. It's to resist internal erosion, to examine where you have subtly agreed with what you once resisted, to ask yourself difficult questions. Where have I softened truth to maintain comfort? Where have I excused what I once confronted? Because if you don't examine it, drift becomes destiny. The woman before March 4th, 6th said not about a date, it's about urgency. There are moments in history and moments in personal life where drift accelerates, where lines blur quickly, where neutrality becomes impossible. And in those moments, the only thing that preserves you is conviction. Compromise always begins quietly, but restoration begins decisively. You can stop the song, you can reclaim clarity, you can realign belief and behavior, but it requires courage, the courage to endure discomfort rather than dilute truth. And here is the final thought I want you to wrestle with. Every time you adjust truth to fit your life, you shrink. Every time you adjust your life to fit truth, you grow. So ask yourself, which direction are you moving? Now, once compromise begins to soften conviction, something else almost inevitably follows: spiritual laziness, not dramatic apostasy, not open rebellion, just gradual neglect. And neglect is far more common and far more dangerous than most people realize. You don't wake up one morning and decide, I will abandon prayer. What happens instead is that prayer becomes optional, then occasional, then reactive. Instead of being the foundation of your life, it becomes the emergency button you press when things collapse, and psychologically, that shift is revealing. Prayer, at its core, is voluntary attention directed toward what transcends you. It is the disciplined act of orienting yourself toward ultimate reality rather than immediate impulse. When you pray consistently, you are training your mind to recognize that you are not the center of the universe. You are acknowledging dependence. You are strengthening humility. You are reinforcing alignment. But when prayer becomes irregular, something subtle happens. Your internal reference point shifts. Instead of asking, what is right, you begin asking, what works? Instead of seeking wisdom, you default to instinct. Instead of aligning yourself upward, you collapse inward. And here's where it becomes psychologically profound. Whatever you repeatedly attend to shapes you. Attention is not neutral. It reorganizes your brain. It structures your priorities. It calibrates your desires. If your attention is dominated by news cycles, social media outrage, endless entertainment, and the pressure of productivity, then those forces will shape your internal world. You will be anxious because you are constantly consuming anxiety. You will become reactive because you are constantly stimulated. And then you will say, I don't feel close to God. But closeness requires attention, and attention requires discipline. The devil doesn't fear believers who own Bibles. He fears believers who own Bibles. He fears believers who open them. He doesn't fear people who identify as Christians. He fears people who daily orient their thoughts toward truth. Spiritual laziness isn't dramatic. It's comfortable. It says, you're tired. It says, you've already heard that sermon. It says, you'll make time tomorrow. And tomorrow becomes next week. And next week becomes next week. And what fills the vacuum left by prayer is not neutrality, it's noise. You cannot remove disciplined spiritual practice from your life without something else taking its place. The human psyche abhors a vacuum. If you are not intentionally forming your mind, it will be passively formed by whatever is loudest. This is why neglect is so dangerous. It doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like busyness. It feels like responsibility. It feels like exhaustion. But beneath that surface, something essential is eroding: your capacity for stillness. And without stillness, you lose discernment. Philosophically, prayer is not merely about requesting outcomes. It is about recalibrating perception. It is about stepping outside your immediate emotional reactions and reorienting yourself toward what is eternally true. When you stop doing that, you become trapped in immediacy. Every frustration feels catastrophic. Every delay feels threatening. Every uncertainty feels intolerable. You become governed by mood, and a mood-driven life is unstable. Consider what consistent prayer actually does. It forces you to articulate your fears. It compels you to confront your motives. It invites correction. It humbles pride. It says selfish ambition. It slows you down enough to think clearly. In psychological terms, it integrates you. It aligns your higher values with your daily actions. It strengthens executive control over impulse. It reinforces long-term meaning over short-term gratification. Without it, fragmentation and tension, you feel scattered, distracted, restless. And you don't always know why. Spiritual laziness convinces you that you can maintain strength without movement, but no system functions that way. Your body requires nourishment, your mind requires stimulation, and your spirit requires alignment. Neglect always produces weakness, not immediately, but inevitably, and here is the uncomfortable truth. Weakness invites influence. When you are spiritually undernourished, you are more easily swayed. Fear hits harder. Temptation feels stronger. Doubt spreads faster. You lack the internal stability that daily communion cultivates. Then you wonder why anxiety grows, why peace feels distant, why clarity fades. Why peace feels distant, why clarity fades. It is not because God withdrew. It is because you stopped drawing near. There is also a deeper philosophical issue here. Discipline precedes freedom. This is true in every domain of life. The musician practices scales. The athlete trains relentlessly. The scholar studies for years. Why? Because structure creates capacity. And the same principle applies spiritually. Daily devotion is not restrictive. It is liberating, is not restrictive. It is liberating. It strengthens your capacity to endure difficulty without collapse. It builds resilience. It stabilizes identity. But laziness always offers an easier narrative. You don't need that much structure. You're fine. It's not that serious until it is serious. And by then, rebuilding strength is far more difficult than maintaining it would have been. So the question becomes intensely practical. What governs your mornings? What shapes your thoughts? Before the world begins shouting, what anchors you before chaos accelerates? Because if you do not deliberately choose that anchor, something else will choose you. The warning here is not emotional manipulation. It is structural reality. If you weaken the disciplines that sustain you, you will drift, not because you intended to, but because entropy is the default state of everything that is neglected. And the enemy understands entropy very well. So perhaps the most radical act of resistance in this moment is not dramatic activism. It is quiet consistency. It is opening scripture when you don't feel like it. It is praying when your emotions resist. It is choosing stillness in a culture addicted to noise. Because strength is built in private before it is tested in public. And here is the reflection I want you to carry with you. If you don't schedule time with God, something else will schedule you. And whatever controls your schedule eventually controls your soul. Once conviction begins to soften and discipline begins to erode, relationships inevitably become the next battleground. And nowhere is that more evident than within the church itself. Because if the enemy cannot corrupt your theology outright and cannot completely dismantle your spiritual habits, he will aim at something just as destabilizing, your unity. Division is extraordinarily efficient. It requires very little effort and produces immense damage. Let's think about this carefully. Human beings are meaning-seeking creatures, but we are also status-sensitive creatures. We are acutely aware of hierarchy, belonging, recognition, and respect. When those things feel threatened, when we feel overlooked, misunderstood, or undervalued, something defensive rises within us. And that defensiveness, if left unchecked, quickly becomes offense. Offense feels justified. That's why it's so seductive. It tells you that you are standing for yourself. It frames resentment as self-respect. It interprets withdrawal as wisdom. But psychologically, what often happens is far less noble. We construct narratives that protect our pride, but they don't appreciate me. They always do this. I'm done. Notice how absolute the mind simplifies complex relational dynamics into moral weight. repeated passing in of the willing in your internal story, forgiveness becomes difficult because forgiveness is required time. Now consider what this does to a community of believers. The church is not merely an organization. It is a collective body by our shared truth and shared submission to something higher than personal preference. So as personal offense begins to outrun shared hurt and fracture is inevitable. The enemy understands something fundamental. A divided body loses force. Energy that should be directed outward in service and witness gets redirected inward in conflict and suspicion. And here is where it becomes spiritually serious. Unforgiveness is not neutral. It changes you. It alters your perception. It reshapes your personality. When you rehearse an offense repeatedly in your mind, you deepen the emotional groove. The resentment becomes familiar, and familiarity breeds attachment. You begin to identify with your grievance. And once grievance becomes identity, reconciliation feels like betrayal, because letting go would mean surrendering a piece of yourself. This is why division is so destructive. It doesn't just break relationships, it reshapes character. It fosters cynicism. It cultivates distrust. It encourages isolation. And isolation is profoundly dangerous for the human psyche. We are not designed to function independently of meaningful community. Isolation magnifies distortion. When you remove yourself from relational echo, instability, your internal narratives go unchallenged. You replay events without correction. You amplify slights without perspective. You become increasingly certain of your own interpretation, and certainty without humility is combustible. Now let's approach this philosophically. Unity is not uniformity. It does not require the absence of disagreement. In fact, disagreement handled properly strengthens a community because it forces clarity. But unity does require something difficult, the prioritization of shared truth over personal ego. That requires maturity. It requires the capacity to endure discomfort without immediate retaliation. It requires the strength to ask, could I be wrong? It requires the willingness to confront rather than gossip, to clarify rather than assume, to confront rather than assume, to forgive rather than withdraw. But gossip is easier than confrontation. Withdrawal is easier than dialogue. Resentment is easier than humility. And that is precisely why the enemy loves it when believers sing the song of offense. Because it sounds righteous, it sounds justified, it even sounds discerning. But beneath it often lies pride. Wounded, yes, but pride nonetheless. You see, forgiveness is not primarily about excusing behavior. It is about refusing to let someone else's imperfection govern your internal state. When you refuse to forgive, you grant ongoing authority to the very person you claim to be done with. They continue to occupy your thoughts. They continue to influence your emotions. They continue to shape your perception of others. That is bondage disguised as strength. And within the church, the consequences multiply. Younger believers observe the fracture. Outsiders sense the tension. The message of reconciliation loses credibility when reconciliation is absent. Division does not merely weaken morale, it undermines testimony. Now, this does not mean ignoring injustice or avoiding accountability. There are situations that require boundaries. There are circumstances that require discipline. But even in those moments, the posture matters. Correction can be done with clarity and humility, or it can be done with superiority and contempt. And contempt is corrosive. If compromise erodes conviction and laziness erodes discipline, division erodes love. And love is the structural glue of any enduring community. Without it, truth becomes harsh and discipline becomes legalistic. So the question becomes confrontation. Who are you silently resentful toward? Whose name tightens your chest? What conversation have you avoided because pride feels safer than vulnerability? Because unresolved offense does not remain static. It spreads. It colors your perception of new relationships. It makes you suspicious where trust might have grown, and the tragedy is this. Many believers would rather lead than reconcile. They would rather relocate than repent. They would rather criticize than confront with grace. But growth never occurs in avoidance. It occurs in courageous humility. Unity is not accidental. It is cultivated. It requires intentional forgiveness, repeated patience, and disciplined speech. It demands that we hold truth firmly while holding one another with care. And here is the reality you must wrestle with. If you allow offense to define you, you will eventually isolate yourself. And a divided heart cannot sustain a unified faith. So ask yourself, is your pride worth the fracture? Now, after compromise weakens conviction, after neglect weakens discipline, and after offense weakens unity, there is another distortion that quietly takes root: emotionalism without obedience. And this one is particularly deceptive because it often hides beneath the appearance of spiritual vitality. You can feel deeply moved and still be fundamentally unchanged. That's an uncomfortable truth, but it's a necessary one. Human beings are emotional creatures. Emotion is not the enemy. In fact, emotion is a signal system. It tells you what you value. It reveals what captures your attention. It energizes action. But emotion was never designed to be your authority. It was designed to be a response to truth, not a replacement for it. When faith becomes primarily emotional, it becomes unstable. Think about the modern environment. We are saturated with stimulation, music, imagery, rhetoric, storytelling, all engineered to produce feeling. And feelings are powerful. They create a sense of immediacy. They generate connection. They can even produce the sensation of transformation. But sensation is not the same as sanctification. You can leave a powerful worship experience, feeling elevated, inspired, even tearful, and still return to the same patterns of speech, the same habits of thought, the same compromises in behavior. And if that cycle repeats long enough, you begin to mistake emotional intensity for spiritual maturity. That's where the danger lies. Psychologically, emotion without action creates a kind of internal inflation. You experience the reward of conviction without the cost of obedience. You feel as though something meaningful occurred, and in a sense something did, but if that feeling is not translated into disciplined change, it dissipates. And when it dissipates, you seek another emotional high. This is how faith can subtly shift from transformation to consumption. You begin chasing experiences rather than cultivating character. You measure spiritual health by how moved you felt rather than by how faithfully you lived. But obedience is rarely dramatic. It is often quiet, repetitive, and inconvenient. It is choosing integrity when no one is watching. It is controlling your tongue when irritation rises. It is resisting temptation when desire feels justified. It is forgiving when resentment feels powerful. And none of those acts necessarily produce a surge of emotion. In fact, obedience often feels costly in the moment. It feels like restraint. It feels like sacrifice. It feels like denying yourself something you want. That is precisely why emotionalism is easier. Emotion says, I feel close to God. Obedience asks, are you aligned with Him? And alignment is measurable not by intensity, but by consistency. Now, let's examine this philosophically. A life built on fluctuating emotion is inherently unstable because emotion is reactive. It rises and falls based on circumstances, chemistry, environment, and memory. If your faith depends on feeling inspired, it will falter when you feel exhausted, discouraged, or numb, and there will be seasons when you feel nothing. What sustains you then? Not emotion, conviction, structure, discipline, commitment, structure, discipline. Consider marriage as an analogy. If commitment were based solely on emotional intensity, most marriages would collapse within years. What sustains them is decision, repeated decision to act in accordance with a vow, even when feeling fluctuates. Faith operates similarly. It is covenantal. It is structured. It is anchored in truth that does not change from emotion. And here is where emotions push down into intensity. And here is where emotions push down into faith. When people approach God's presence with emotional sensations, they believe that God has nearness to the dry season. They interpret numbness as abandonment, They assume silence means absence. But maturity understands something deeper. Obedience precedes understanding. Faithfulness precedes feeling. There are days when you will not feel like praying. Pray anyway. There are days when Scripture feels distant. Read anyway. There are days when loving someone feels undeserved. Love anyway, because the aim is not emotional stimulation. The aim is transformation, and transformation is built through repetition. Neuroscience confirms this. Habits shape neural pathways. Repeated action rewires the brain. When you repeatedly choose obedience, you strengthen the very structures that make future obedience more likely. You become stable. But if you repeatedly prioritize feeling over faithfulness, you train yourself to withdraw when feeling fades. And here's the uncomfortable implication. Some believers are spiritually addicted to inspiration. They move from sermon to sermon, conference to conference, song to song, but avoid the mundane disciplines that actually reshape character. Inspiration without implementation produces illusion. You feel strong, but you are fragile. You feel enlightened, but you are undisciplined. You feel close to God, but your private life remains unchanged. The enemy does not fear your tears in worship if they are not followed by obedience in private. He does not fear your emotional declarations if your habits remain untouched. Because obedience is what restructures your life. This does not mean suppressing emotion, it means ordering it. Let emotion respond to truth. Let it energize obedience, but never let it dictate what is true. Ask yourself a hard question. If the emotional intensity were removed, would your faith remain? If the music stopped, if the atmosphere quieted, if the inspiration faded, would you still obey? I did, because that is where maturity is revealed. Spiritual depth is not measured by how high you feel in moments of worship. It is measured by how steadily you walk when no one is watching. And here is the thought I want you to wrestle with. Emotion can ignite your faith, but only obedience can sustain it. So don't just feel the truth, live it. Now, when conviction weakens through compromise, when discipline erodes through neglect, when unity fractures through offense, and when faith becomes emotional rather than obedient, there is a final vulnerability that emerges almost inevitably: fear. And fear, when left unexamined, becomes a governing force. We are living in an age of amplified uncertainty. Economic instability, cultural upheaval, technological acceleration, geopolitical tension. The sheer volume of information alone is enough to destabilize the human nervous system. You are exposed daily to predictions of collapse, warnings of crisis, narratives of decline, and whether you consciously register it or not, your body does. Fear is not merely an idea, it is physiological. Your heart rate shifts, your breathing shortens, your mind narrows, you become hyper-focused on threat. That is what fear does. It compresses perception. It makes the future look hostile and the present feel fragile. Now here is the psychological danger. Whatever you repeatedly imagine begins to feel real. If you constantly rehearse catastrophic scenarios, your nervous system responds as if those scenarios are imminent. And once fear becomes habitual, it reshapes your decisions. You begin to hoard rather than trust. You begin to withdraw rather than engage. You begin to withdraw rather than engage. You begin to control rather than surrender. And suddenly, almost imperceptibly, your faith becomes weak. Fear is powerful because it masquerades as prudence. It says, I'm just being realistic. It says, I need to protect myself. It says, look at what's happening. And certainly wisdom inside the room. The mind is nothing. But fear is not wisdom. Fear is imagination understanding. And believers begin to see inside the truth. Something profound shifts. Instead of interpreting events through the lens of divine sovereignty, they interpret them through the lens of vulnerability. Instead of asking, how can I stand firm? They ask, how can I avoid loss? And avoidance rarely produces courage. Philosophic fear is faith pointed in the wrong direction. It is confidence, but confidence in disaster. It is confidence, but confidence in disaster. It is anticipation, but anticipation of collapse. You are still believing in something. You are simply believing in the worst possible outcome. Now consider what this does spiritually. When fear governs you, your prayer life changes tone. Instead of gratitude and trust, it becomes frantic petition. Instead of alignment with purpose, it becomes desperate protection. You begin to view God as emergency insurance rather than sovereign anchor. And here is the paradox. Fear shrinks your world. It reduces your willingness to take risks. It diminishes generosity. It discourages boldness. It makes you suspicious of opportunity. It convinces you that safety is the highest good. But safety has never been the highest calling of faith. Courage has. Courage does not mean recklessness. It means acting in accordance with truth despite uncertainty. It means acknowledging threat without surrendering to it. It means stepping forward even when outcomes are not guaranteed. And that is precisely what fear tries to prevent. When you are governed by fear, you become reactive rather than principled. You make short-term decisions to alleviate anxiety rather than long-term decisions rooted in conviction. You grasp for control in areas that were never yours to control. But control is often an illusion. The future has always been uncertain. The difference now is not the presence of uncertainty. It is the amplification of it. Technology ensures you are aware of global instability in real time, and constant exposure without disciplined interpretation produces anxiety. So the real question is not whether uncertainty exists. It always has. The question is how you interpret it. Do you interpret instability as evidence that everything is collapsing? Or do you interpret it as a reminder that your foundation must not rest on circumstances? Fear reveals where your trust is placed. If your peace depends on economic security, cultural approval, political stability, or predictable outcomes, then any disruption in those areas will destabilize you. But if your foundation is anchored in something transcendent, something not subject to market fluctuation or social trend, then instability does not have the final word. That does not mean you ignore preparation. It means preparation is guided by wisdom, not panic. It means awareness does not devolve into obsession. It means you refuse to let worst-case scenarios define your identity. Because here is what fear ultimately seeks to do. It wants to paralyze you. A fearful believer hesitates to speak truth. A fearful believer avoids responsibility. A fearful believer avoids responsibility. A fearful believer retreats into comfort. And when enough people retreat, cultural decay accelerates, not because courage is absent. The enemy does not need to destroy you if he can intimidate you, and intimidation is most effective when it feels justified. So examine your internal dialogue. What narrative are you rehearsing about the future? Are you magnifying threat more than promise? Are you consuming information that inflames anxiety without strengthening conviction? You cannot control global events, but you can control what governs your imagination. Faith does not deny reality. It reframes it. It acknowledges difficulty while asserting sovereignty. It admits uncertainty while affirming purpose. It faces the future without illusion, but also without surrender, because surrendering to fear is surrendering your authority. The call here is not naivete, it is alignment. Anchor yourself so deeply in truth that turbulence does not uproot you. Cultivate courage intentionally. Limit the voices that amplify panic. Strengthen the disciplines that reinforce trust. And remember this, if fear dictates your decisions, it will quietly dictate your destiny. So ask yourself, are you preparing wisely or are you panicking quietly? So after all of this, after examining compromise, neglect, division, emotional instability, and fear, we arrive at the decisive point. The final warning is not about identifying problems. It is about choosing a posture, because ultimately, this is about agreement. Every human being is always in agreement with something, with a belief, with a narrative, with a hierarchy of values, You are either aligned with truth intentionally, or you are drifting toward whatever is loudest, easiest, or most socially rewarded. There is no neutral position. There is only conscious alignment or unconscious conformity. When we say, stop singing the wrong song, we are talking about withdrawing agreement. We are talking about refusing to internalize narratives that weaken conviction, erode discipline, fracture unity, elevate emotion over obedience, and magnify fear over faith. And that requires something increasingly rare, Deliberate self-examination. Most people prefer distraction to reflection. It is far easier to critique culture than to scrutinize your own compromises. It is easier to blame division on others than to confront your own pride. It is easier to condemn fear publicly than to admit anxiety privately, But transformation never begins externally. It begins internally. You must be willing to observe yourself without defensiveness, to notice patterns, to detect rationalizations, to identify where your actions have diverged from your stated beliefs. That kind of awareness is uncomfortable, but discomfort is not your enemy. It is often the gateway to clarity. Now here's a deeper philosophical reality. Identity is shaped by repetition. You become what you consistently choose. If you consistently choose convenience over conviction, you become compliant. If you consistently choose discipline over impulse, you become stable. If you consistently choose courage over fear, you become resilient. Character is not formed in dramatic moments. It is formed in accumulated decisions, and the world does not need more reactive believers. It needs anchored ones. People whose convictions are not negotiable when pressure increases. People whose prayer life is not conditional on mood. People whose unity is not shattered by disagreement. People whose obedience is not dependent on emotional intensity. People whose courage is not dismantled by uncertainty. Standing firm is not loud. It is not theatrical. It is steady. To stand means you have already decided who you are. Before the pressure arrives, you have clarified your values in advance. You have established disciplines that do not fluctuate with circumstance. You have reconciled relationships where possible. You have trained your emotions to follow truth rather than dictate it. You have anchored your imagination in promise rather than catastrophe. Standing is the result of preparation, and here's what makes this urgent. Pressure reveals structure. When stress increases, whatever is weak collapses, whatever is superficial fractures, whatever is performative dissolves. If your faith is built on cultural approval, it will not survive cultural rejection. If your spiritual life is built on inspiration alone, it will not survive emotional dryness. If your relationships are built on convenience, they will not survive conflict. If your peace is built on predictability, it will not survive disruption. So the call is simple but not easy. Strengthen what you claim to believe. Examine your compromises and close the gaps. Rebuild neglected disciplines with consistency. Pursue reconciliation where pride has lingered. Translate emotion into obedience. Replace catastrophic imagination with This is not about panic. It is about alignment with life. The enemy's strategy is fragmentation. Fragment your attention. Fragment your attention. Fragment your conviction. Fragment your relationship. Fragment your confidence. Because fragmented people are unstable people, and unstable people are easily influenced. But integration produces strength. When belief, action, speech, and intent are aligned, you become difficult to move, not rigid but grounded. There is something profoundly powerful about a person who has quietly decided, I will not drift. Not because they are superior, not because they are untempted, but because they are anchored. And that anchoring is not passive. It requires repetition. It requires daily correction. It requires daily correction. It requires courage. It requires choosing the narrow path when the broader one looks easier. You do not drift into strength. You drift into weakness. Strength is intentional. So the final warning is this: do not wait for crisis to clarify your convictions. Clarify them now. Do not wait for division to practice forgiveness. Practice it now. Do not wait for fear to overwhelm you before you cultivate courage. Cultivate it now. Because when turbulence increases, and it always does, you will not rise to the level of your intentions. You will fall to the level of your preparation. Shemp, you will fall to the level of your preparation. And here is what I want you to leave with you cannot control the storm, but you can decide whether you will stand when it arrives. So decide now.